Okay, so I'll just set the agenda then, David. So today we're going to go through the second of the webinars, and this one's on requirements, risk, and test management. And what we're going to do is David's going to take you through an overview of it, and I am then going to go on and show you an overview of ProcedureCapture and also demonstrate those key features in terms of risk assessment. So, David, there's the slides up on your pretty face and your experience, if you want to start on that.
Great. Well, I think people can read that for themselves. Apologies for the confusion today, everybody. I found out we had an unannounced FDA inspection. We found out about that yesterday, so slight juggling of things here. If we can go to the next slide, Robbie, that's great. Well, let's look at the history of requirements management, risk, and test management in the industry. So for those of us who've been around in life sciences testing for a while, we'll understand the importance of requirements traceability. But very often we're not quite sure where that's derived from or why. This goes back to initially US FDA recommendations in their general principles for software validation guidance. For those of you who are familiar with that document, you'll know that there are a number of places in that document where they talk about traceability. And you can see on the slide here the various parts of that document where traceability is pulled out. So it's not as if there's a simple table that says you have to trace this to this and this. It's very much in there in the text. And as you can see, that document requires us to trace our system requirements to our software requirements and to trace those to our risk analysis results, to trace our software specifications to our software requirements. Those software requirements should also be traced to software design, and then the risk analysis should be traced to our software design, source code, to specifications and test procedures. So it's not particularly clear, and the history of that FDA guidance document is that it was originally intended as a guidance document for the validation of software in a medical device. And it was written at a time when everybody was developing custom software, so it's not that easy to understand. But in that document, there's no actual requirement for a requirements traceability matrix. The term that's used in the FDA guidance is requirements traceability analysis. There's no need, as I say, for a requirements traceability matrix. That was something that was suggested in earlier versions of the GAMP guide. But again, GAMP is guidance, and an RTM is never mandatory, even though when I work on lots of projects, I still hear people jumping up and down saying, we must have a requirements traceability matrix. But the reality is the regulatory expectation is that we can perform requirements traceability analysis. So if we can go to the next slide, Robbie, we've tried to put that into a diagrammatic form in terms of what could be traced in a traceability analysis, and we should say that what you actually have to trace to something else very much depends upon the complexity of the software you're developing, the specific software development lifecycle you're following, so whether it's an off-the-shelf COTS product or whether it is a product where you're doing customization. And it also depends on what your project-specific documentation deliverables are. So if you're not producing a software requirements document, you're producing, I don't know, use cases, for instance, you have to have appropriate traceability to meet those requirements. So it is important to understand the expectations of the regulators and come up with appropriate traceability for the particular project, the particular software that you're working on. So if we can move on to the risk-based validation slide, Robbie, that will be great. So talking about the aspects of risk-based validation. Risk-based validation became more common once GAMP4 was launched back many years ago now in Amsterdam. And what happened as a result of GAMP4 being launched? We saw lots of projects, lots of organisations performing risk assessments, but not necessarily doing anything with those risk assessments. They were documenting it, but they weren't using the results to actually scale their validation approach at all. And we also saw that early risk assessment and risk analysis models could be very complicated. I worked on projects where people were borrowing failure mode and effect analysis risk assessment models from the nuclear industry, for instance, which is way too complicated for most of the software we're validating. If it was, again, a high-risk application which had safety implications on a manufacturing plant, then those more formal techniques might be applicable. But for a lot of software, the very rigorous FMEA approaches, multidimensional and so on, can be very complex. Now, GAMP5 placed much more focus on risk-based validation, telling us what we should be doing with the results of our risk analysis to scale the verification activities, which of course includes testing. But even that, in quote, standard GAMP5 risk assessment model, which comes out of Appendix M3 in GAMP5, can sometimes still be overly complex. So sometimes figuring out, what high, medium, and low risk severity or risk probability is can be complicated, where you can actually make a much simpler assumption. So on a project, you might say, for instance, if it's GAMP software category 4, it's configurable, we'll say that it's low risk probability because configurations are relatively easy to get right. But if it's category 5, we've got customization in there, then we'll give it a higher probability of risk. And trying to figure out what medium might be doesn't make any sense. Very often also we find that risk detectability doesn't add any extra discrimination to our software risk analysis, where all software functions in the system have the same level of detectability. Adding that complexity to the risk analysis doesn't really give us any more discrimination. And the important thing, if we look at our risk models, our standards coming out of the pharmaceutical and medical devices industry, so ICH Q9 and ISO 14971, both of those documents allow us to scale our risk assessment or risk analysis model based upon the high level risk of the system or software itself. So we can use simpler or more complex risk assessment models depending on the project and depending on the software. So if we go on to the next slide then, Robbie, talk a little bit more about traceability. So I mentioned traditional requirements traceability matrices. A lot of projects still use those, but they do have drawbacks. So first of all, they have to be manually updated with requirements and test cases. It's relatively easy to make mistakes. A lot of people use spreadsheets for these or tables in Word documents. And there's a lot of work involved in updating them. And what they're not very good at is handling one-to-many or many-to-many relationships between requirements and test cases. And in a number of examples, we'll have a test case where it's actually testing multiple requirements, but equally another test case will test some of those requirements again, and a traditional requirements traceability matrix just doesn't handle that well. It can also be time consuming to identify requirements that haven't been covered by tests. And it can be difficult to really understand the risk associated with requirements when you're planning your tests. So although requirements traceability matrices fulfill the basic purpose of demonstrating requirements coverage, they're not the best tool. And as I mentioned earlier, again, many projects still use the GAMP high, medium and low risk model with severity, probability, detectability and so on. And again, that can be difficult to apply to either a very simple system or to a more complex system. And sometimes, I'll be honest, I work on projects and people are trying to fudge the criteria by which they're determining risk to try and fit in with the GAMP model rather than using a more appropriate model. And again, very often that's a separate exercise to our requirements traceability. So looking at the next slide, many people over the years have developed their own tools to do risk management and requirements management, typically using some sort of relational database. But many people have asked there must be a better way. And again, for those of you who joined us on the last webcast, will know that Reltus have worked with a lot of people in the industry, both consultants like myself and customers, to really understand the needs of the industry and come up with something better. So Robbie and the team and myself looked at this I guess a good few years ago now, Robbie, wasn't it? And looked at how we could better support requirements traceability and risk assessment and risk management in the ProcedureCapture tool. So as we'll see when we get onto the demonstration, ProcedureCapture integrates requirements management at multiple levels. It allows you to obviously trace those requirements to the test cases at all of those levels. It supports risk assessment of those requirements at each level. It gives inherent traceability between the requirement and the risk. But it also allows you to choose which risk assessment model is appropriate to the project, to the specific software and system. And it makes it then very easy to understand this test is associated with this risk and this requirement, and what sort of testing should we do? Should this be a positive case test, a challenge test, a negative case test, and so on? And as you'll see, it's all built into the tool. It's really so easy to use. Quite frankly, I feel like pulling my hair out on projects where it's not used. So that sets the scene, a bit of history. And with that, I'll hand over to Robbie. We can actually see the software in action. I think that's the best thing, Robbie. Yeah.
Yes, that's fine, David. Thank you for that. What I'll do is I'm just going to go through a couple of slides to just put that in context of the tool itself. I mean, obviously there are people who've joined the first one who will have seen this, a little bit of this before, but if somebody's new, just to give you a quick feel for it, I'm not going to go into any great detail, and then I will drill down into the functionality and actually show you that those points that David has brought across there. So just to give you a quick introduction to us, I mean, we've been involved in writing test tools for 25 years. There is some of our customers. The Altus ProcedureCapture tool works on all application browsers and platforms, and it's built specifically for subject matter experts and doesn't need a programming resource. Just to give you a sort of pictorial overview of what we have. So, you know, the risk-based approach to this propagates throughout all the different pieces of the life cycle, whether that's to do with, you know, managing requirements and the risk assessment associated with those requirements, capturing test scripts, review and approval, and then you can execute in a number of different ways depending on whether you want to do it in a more traditional paper way or, as more and more people are doing, a paperless electronic way, and that's what we covered in the first webinar, was the automation of that. Obviously that then also includes if you find any errors in any of that testing, defect tracking, and generates your traceability matrices. You can also produce end user training guides from your test scripts. But the overarching risk propagates throughout that, and I will take you through each of that and how that manifests itself when you're going through. So just to touch on that risk assessment, so we have basically a systems risk and a requirements risk assessment. And as David pointed out, we have taken multiple sort of GAMP risk models that you can use in terms of deciding the complexity of it and what you want included in it. And you decide what you're going to do, and you can set then the system and the risk model that it's going to use. The requirements risk, you can also version before and after and see what the mitigation is in terms of doing it. And the important point to note is, obviously, while you're doing the risk assessment, is that you can then propagate that risk throughout your tests, and also if you, from the test, if you find any defects, and allows you to give the right scope and rigor to both the testing and what defects you fix. So sort of in the requirements piece itself, we have the ability to have these three grids together in terms of user functional design. We can automatically link the hierarchy of those together, and then you can use those to, when you're creating the test scripts, to select the requirement and the test script that relates to those requirements and pick up on the risk priority for it. When you're looking at the requirements in real time as well, you can see, you know, what risk is associated with those requirements, what has happened to the test scripts relating to those, not just in terms of execution passes and fails, but also, you know, what type of tests they are and what you've covered in terms of the risk, whether you have the right scope and rigor there in terms of your risk priority. So that's your requirements. Just quickly on the test scripts themselves, if you saw the last webinar or you picked it up on the recording of it, we capture everything as a visual storyboard that enables everybody to understand what's going on with the risk. As I said, once you take your test scripts, you can then, basically the test script will automatically take the risk of the requirement that it satisfies. And that basically is the way of making sure that, you know, the test script reflects, if you like, the severity of the requirement, and it's not just an arbitrary measure of somebody deciding what priority to give the test script. Our test scripts work on anything, as I said earlier, and they work end-to-end across any procedure. You can also then review and approve those test scripts and lock them and execute them. Once you've done that, you can then, as showed in the diagram, you can either do paperless, which I discussed in the last webinar in terms of both session-based and structural or scripted testing, and you can also automate those or manually execute those. Once you get your results, you can electronically sign them, or if you want to, you can run it as a paper execution. From the defects perspective as well, you know, it again picks up on this risk. So if you have a test script that's been given a risk from the requirement that it satisfies and the test script fails, then the defect will pick up on the risk that the defect is relating to in terms of the test script. And that way you can see what's going on in terms of your importance of the defect, as opposed to, again, somebody picking an arbitrary measure to look at it and decide how important it is. It reflects directly back to the test script and directly back to the requirements. And that means that it's an accurate reflection of what you need to fix first. You can also track it through the system, the life cycle, in terms of what's going on with its status. And the other important thing is that you can see the actual execution history of the defect. So what are the steps that actually caused the defect in the first place, the sequence of steps that caused the defect, which for a programmer is, you know, nearly gold dust in terms of understanding how to fix it, because they can replicate what the issue is. So that's a brief overview of that. All the documentation we have, including, you know, all the risk pieces of it, come out in such a way that when you look at it, you can understand exactly what has happened, and you have the documented evidence of your executions, of your traceability, of your audit trail, your end user guides, and all that uses your own templates to give the look and feel that you're used to, basically. So that's a quick overview of what we have. What I'm going to do now is actually take you through this in terms of, you know, risk. So the first thing really is to look at the overall dashboards to give you the status of what's happening with your validation effort. And I'll touch on, you know, how much more prevalent your information is when you have that in terms of risk, so that I can see, you know, both the requirements, tests, and defects, what is going on. And when you add in the risk context to that, you're able to see it in, you know, exactly what's going on with the status of your validation. I'll then go and show the risk assessment and the different types of, firstly, of how to set the system risk, and to choose your model, basically, in terms of which model you're going to use for which system. I'll then go and do a requirements actual risk assessment, and I'll take a URS and risk assess that URS. I'll then show you how that, within the requirements, how that then translates into being able to understand your requirements, where you are with your requirements, how they link together, and which pieces of the requirements you have used for which pieces of the assessment. And then also the traceability in real time between the requirement and the test scripts that satisfy it. I'll then go into the test scripts themselves and show you how you actually attach that requirement risk directly to the test script, and what that looks like in terms of the execution results and the risk that relates to. And then lastly, how if you find a defect in the testing, how the risk comes through again to show you which ones are, you need to fix from an importance level. Okay, so let's go and close that, and we'll bring up the tool itself. So the first thing really is those dashboards in terms of your overall what is going on with my project. So I have my different dashboards that I can bring up in terms of showing me what's going on with my first one I'll bring up as my requirements. So I have the various different things that I can drill down into my requirements, and this shows me the different requirement types, the risk priority of those requirements, whether it's GXP, execution status, so that would be the roll-up of all the test scripts relating to the requirements, approval status, and what system it relates to. And I can do things like, get it over time down here, so I can change within a time period what I'm looking at. I can then also drill down into, my different types of requirements. So if I have my user requirements here, I can drill down into my user requirements, and I can see, who has failed, who has passed in terms of the test scripts, and I can also see that in terms of a risk. So if I go into my risk, I can start to see, okay, so of my high risk requirements, how many have failed, how many have passed, and it gives you an overview in terms of your requirements by risk of what is happening with my system. I can similarly do it for my tests overview as well. So, if I start to look at, by execution, so let's say, what's passed, what's failed. But obviously, it makes more sense if you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, I have 100 that have failed. What is the priority of the ones that have failed, basically? And I can then drill down into those particular ones to see what type of tests they are, what scope of tests they are, and what type of tests they are. So that gives you the ability from the test perspective in terms of looking at your overall picture, and similarly for your defects view as well in terms of, I can say, by resolution or by status even, I can say, where am I with those, and then if I want to drill down into the ones that are, that have high risk priority, I can drill down into how many are open, how many are resolved, and see in real time the relationship between your overview and the risks that relates to. So that's a kind of on your overviews of your dashboards. So if I just jump straight into now the risk element of it. So as I said, we have both sort of a systems risk and a requirements risk. So first of all, let's touch on the system, what's in the systems view. And the systems view really has, I suppose, three pieces to it for each of the systems. So I can, if I want, I can obviously have my, I can define one system, or I can define multiple systems. And if I go into the system here, I'll pick one here, you can have your, and people use this as a register of their systems, basically. So it tells you that the details of the system, and then it also does two other things. If you want to use your if you want to do an impact analysis on your system, because different people will sometimes use the system risk as the overarching impact, basically, and they say that no impact will be higher than the overall system impact. Some other people just use the URS. But if you're going to use the system impact, it is a combination of your GAMP category in terms of your software guide, and also then obviously the impact on patient safety, quality, or business critical data, and obviously the mix of those two gives you your overall medium category for this particular system that you are relating to. And you can then use that in your requirements if that's one of the ways that you want to use the system impact later on, and I'll show you in a minute how that works. The other thing that you do at the system level is I decide which risk model I'm going to use. So as David said, there are numerous different models that make sense to use for not only different systems, but obviously for the situation that you're in. So they go from sort of the simplest, which is just a low and high category, and they only have impact and probability, and this would be your simplest one. And that goes down to then sort of a more complex one, which has low, high, medium in terms of impact and probability to give you your priority here. And then if you add in detectability, you can again have simple with no detectability on high, low, or the most complicated, which is complex with detectability. And that would relate back to the standardized 3x3, first to get impact probability and then take the result and put it in detectability. So you can decide for each of your systems what type of model here that you want to use in terms of your risk model. So that's your systems risk. And then for each of my assessments that I have, you have a record of the assessment that you have done for each of the requirements. And that assessment will pick up the system that you have allocated to the requirement, and also then, what type of model it is, and what impact you have, what values you're picking up. So when I'm looking at that, I can pick up a number of different things on impact. So I could pick up the system impact here, or I can use, my URS impact or any of the other grids impacts. And the same with probability, although obviously you wouldn't use the system one, but you can pick up the, if you like, the component parts. And quite often it makes more sense to do probability and detectability at the functional level as opposed to doing it at the impact level. So that then picks it up, and obviously then you get your calculated risk priority from that. So that's on your risk, and let's go and actually, do it for requirements. So if I go and look at my requirements here, I would have a list of, my requirements here. Firstly on URS, and I will have a different risk priority for each one. These are obviously then the children of the user requirement that are the functional requirements that relate to that. And I can see the actual hierarchy of how that fits together here in terms of user requirements to functional requirements, and then if you have any design specifications. So I can use and pick up at any of these levels either your probability, impact, or detectability that you want to use. So and that allows you to do things, like, when you're looking at your requirements, you can start to see, okay, what type of requirements do I have here in terms of my, overview of high, medium, low, etc. requirements. And I can also then set a requirement. So let's go and pick this requirement here, which I'm going to set the risk for. So we haven't got a risk priority for this, but I need to first of all here is set the system for it. So when I open that requirement, you can see that I have all the attributes of this requirement in terms of what it does. And I can then go and pick from those systems that I showed you earlier on which one we're going to use. So if I pick I'll pick that custom accounts receivable, and that will pick up not only the system, but obviously the GAMP model that assessment is going to use. If I have at the user level, if I want to add in my different impact probability or detectability, and here I'm going to use the impact at the URS level. So as you can see, when I say done, this has picked up the system. So to risk assess this, I'll go and start the risk assessment. And as you can see, this is the model that it's picked up from the system. And I will now go and pick the component parts that I want to use within this assessment. So the first thing I'll do is I won't use the system impact, I'll use the URS impact. So this is going to give me a value of medium. And then on the probability, it makes more sense to use the functional requirements. So I can actually see the hierarchy of what's included in the functional requirements below that. and we've obviously taken, if there are different values, you would obviously take the, from the probability side, you would take the highest one of those. And on detectability then, I would do it again from the FS level, and obviously from detectability, it's the other way around, and that you will always pick the lowest one because it gives you the worst case scenario effectively, which is what you want to do. And as you can see, this has then added those in to give me a risk priority of high. So that's how you would basically take the different component parts that make sense in terms of your own risk assessment to create that risk assessment here. And you can see there that I've created the risk assessment of high in terms of doing that. And that, once you've created that risk assessment, then obviously when you're in your requirements view, you can then use that risk assessment to give you information on what is going on with your system. So if I take up the real-time traceability here, what I can do is I have my requirements here. So if I go and let's drill down on, we'll drill down on the URSs, I can see, in terms of my risk priority, what is happening in terms of going on with these user requirements. And that's, I can also see the execution status of what has happened to all the test scripts that relate to that as well. So if I look across here, I can see, what is happening in terms of the test scripts that relate to that. And if I then, I could say, so show me, the failures and the not runs, and that's fine. But wouldn't it be better to show, what that in terms of the risk priority as well, so that you can see, for my failures, how many of them are high risk, and that will show you how many of them are high risk in terms of your test scripts, and that allows you also to look at, what in your if you have your SOPs and you have, what type of test scripts I need to have for different risk priorities. You can easily trace across and see not only what has happened in terms of each individual test script that relates to the high risk requirements, but have you covered, your test scripts here. So I can see, I've obviously covered quite a lot on that one, but this one here, which is a high risk, I haven't covered anything in terms of doing it. So on these both, and this one here, I've only covered a positive test. So if my SOPs say for high risk, I need to obviously create the test scripts for these and add in some new test scripts for these ones to cover that. So that gives you an overview of your requirements in terms of your traceability and what's going on there. So let's look at how that translates down into your tests as well. So here is my overall my whole testing that I have done, and these are all the test scripts. They are different types of tests in terms of scripted or session based, and here is the execution results for all my tests that go on. And I could obviously then look at, if I have one here which has the test script properties, I can I can link this directly to requirements that I have risk assessed. So I can simply go and pick the requirements here that I have risk assessed. So as you can see, if I pick a requirement, what it does is it picks up the risk priority for the requirement. And then if I pick up, if it's a test script that relates to two requirements, obviously you want to know that, it's a high risk test case because it relates to a requirement that's high risk, even though it also relates to a low risk one. You want to make sure that you don't treat it with the wrong priority and miss it on the, if you like, on the wrong side of it. So if I go and pick up that requirement that I've just assessed, that was number 19, which was my high risk one that I've just assessed, you can see that we then pick up that this is a high risk test case because it's picked up the highest of these two in terms of doing it. And I can also then decide, if what type of test it is in terms of the test scope. So I can, whatever type of test it is, I can then look in my traceability to make sure that I have covered the right scope and rigor of testing for the risk. So if I save that as a test script, you can see that I now have the right risk priority. And that, when you're looking at your test scripts, obviously you're going to look at, give me the execution results of what's happened in terms of my failures and my passes. But that doesn't really give you the inside information in terms of, well, how important is that in terms of, the failures of these? What does it reflect in terms of the requirements of these tests? And by putting in then your risk priority in here, you can see, for my failures, how many high-risk requirements have I failing, and quite a few. So, it gives you that granularity to see in real terms what the actual passes and failures mean in terms of the requirements that they relate to and where you are with a project. So, if you have like this one where you have 63 failures at a high level and a high priority level, you're going to go, this is not great. Whereas obviously if you had it at, the number was the other way around and the lows were 63, then you would be looking to say, okay, I need to look at that, but that gives you a more accurate reflection of where you are in terms of the test scripts that are there. So that's how that comes down to, where it gets the risk priority from and in terms of coming across from the requirements that relates to. And this is also true of the defects. So if I run these test scripts and they fail basically, and I create a defect directly from the test scripts, I can then see, in the defects, I can see, from my defects view, here I have, again, the risk priority of the defect, and the defect comes directly from the test script. So, let's quickly open the test script there, you can see that this medium comes directly from the running of that test script. And that means that when you're in your defects, you can actually see, which defects you want to, in terms of the priority of the defects. And normally, the issue with defects is how do you decide, what's an important defect and what's the priority of the defect. Quite often it can be somebody, a developer or somebody arbitrary looking at it and going, well, I think this is that important, but it doesn't directly correlate back to the test script or back to the requirement that relates to. So being able to see, here is my defects, and then also, if you want to do it by status, you can say, what is happening in terms of my high risk defects, and you can see, that what are open, what's resolved, what's not resolved, and obviously, you still have a lot of high risk defects here, so, that's what they should be working on. Okay, so what I've done there really is looked at, the requirements, the risk, in terms of setting the system and the requirement risk, how that translates into traceability to the requirements themselves, and then back to the test cases that will relate to in terms of that. I'm using the sort of risk-based validation lifecycle within the tool allows you to give an accurate overview of what the status of any validation project is. It reduces the amount of overall testing because you can focus on the right level and scope for the important things. It prioritizes defects and which ones to fix first. And it also then gives you the documented and traceability evidence from a regulatory perspective. And you're able to show why you have prioritized something for the risk it is, and how that then traces throughout the life cycle in terms of across the whole life cycle. Okay, that really is all I wanted to cover in terms of that. Let's see if we have any questions. just the last thing to say would be that we have a third one, which is regularly compliant testing for agile SDLCs and the introduction of session-based testing and what that looks like and how that can be used and how it can be fitted into that life cycle. So before we take any questions, David, are you there for any final comments?
Yes, I just wanted, as you were going through the demonstration, I was just minded of a project I was working on a few years ago, where, if I'm perfectly honest, the end user pharmaceutical company was using an alternative test product. Other software test products are available, but towards the end of the test cycles, we had some test failures, and the customer quite rightly asked the question: are any of these test failures critical to good clinical practice? It's a GCP project, and it took us, no word of a lie, 2 days to go through the traceability and the requirements documents to be able to answer that question. And all the time we were waiting to go live with this system. And the issue was, although we had another test tool, because the risk assessment and the requirements traceability weren't integrated, we had to go back to, manual methods to be able to trace everything back and answer those questions. So the time saving of having all of this integrated in one tool, it really is significant. And I think you guys have actually succeeded in making the job boring, which the key thing here is, if people are serious about the quality of their systems and software, and doing the right testing rather than just being seen to do testing, which is the case in some cases, finally people have got the tool to do that, and it's great. Not just for the initial go live, but throughout the life of the system, to be able to maintain this as you make changes to the system, assess the impact of that, really considerable in terms of time saving.
Okay, great. I've a couple of questions coming in here. Let me just open this. So the first one I have here, and I think this might be in your domain, David. It says, what is the purpose of requirements traceability and why do the FDA recommend this?
I guess the simple answer there is the FDA, and not just the FDA, but the regulatory authorities expect us to have tested all of our requirements. Now, it might not be that we've tested them on this project, because with a risk-based approach, it might be that your software vendor has tested certain functions. But we need to be able to demonstrate that if the requirements are important enough for us to document, then they should all have been tested, and these days should have been tested on risk. And although this doesn't come out of FDA guides, I think the other big advantage of requirements traceability is actually during a regression analysis. So if you're doing a regression analysis, which is something the regulators are hot on, the ability to quickly trace backwards and forwards between, we've got a change in requirements here, that's implemented in this configuration or that code. If I change that, what other requirements are linked to that configuration or code, and should I retest those as part of my regression testing? Having good requirements traceability enables you to ask those questions and answer them relatively quickly. Great.
I have another one here. If I have multiple risk-assessed requirements satisfied by a test script, which risk priority is assigned to the test script? Mark, maybe you could take that one.
Yeah, certainly. And here we have, I think, in fact, if you remember part of Robbie's demo, that when you have when you go and pick the requirements associated with your test script, it will automatically look through and take the highest risk element. So if you have a combination of high, lows, and mediums, and you have a high, it will always take the high. If the high is the medium, it will take the medium. And in that way, that priority is always flowing through from your requirement through your test script, and then on, in fact, into your defects.
Okay, thank you. Another one, there's a couple more just come in there. So Here's a good one. David, maybe you can answer this. How much time can be saved through the use of risk-based testing?
I guess the answer we should give, if any regulators are listening, is none. The idea is to spend the right amount of time focusing on the right risk and the right requirements. So in theory, we should be able to reduce the level of testing we do on our low risk requirements and do more testing of the high risk requirements. So do some challenge testing, some negative case testing and so on. But I think in reality, depends on the system. So if you've got a system with a relatively small proportion of high risk requirements, if you scale the testing appropriately, then it is possible to save time. Obviously, the reverse is true. If you've got a highly critical system, you could, in theory, end up spending more time testing than you didn't. I mean, we were in a situation 5-10 years ago where people were doing risk assessments and still doing the same amount of testing that they always did. And then when GAMP5 came out, people thought about it a little bit more intelligently. So there is the opportunity to save time, but there is certainly the opportunity to do more effective testing.
Okay, great. We'll just finish up with there's two more here, and I'll just finish up quickly. Mark, maybe you can answer this one. Can I change the risk priority of a defect?
In the simple answer up front is no, because the risk priority of the defect flows from the test script that you use to generate the defect. So, and of course, it is taken from the risk priority of the requirement that it in turn satisfies. So the idea would be no, that you shouldn't and wouldn't necessarily want to do that. Now, the one caveat I will add to that, if you're not using, say, our requirements management component, the risk priority of the test script itself can be assigned manually, and that will then flow into the defect that's associated with the test. But by and large, it's a requirements then test script, and the defect picks it up from the test script which got it from the requirement. So in principle, no. But if you're not using our requirements management component, there is a way to control your defect status.
Okay, just the last one. We'll finish up on this. Other than testing, how else can risk assessment be used to scale verification activities? David, perhaps you want to finish with that one.
Yes, so testing is one form of verification. Obviously, verification goes throughout the SDLC. So once you've done your risk assessment of your requirements, you can choose to scale other verification activities. So the degree of formality and rigor with which you conduct code review can be scaled, for instance. You might choose to review your configuration settings on the basis of risk. So for your high risk requirements and the associated configuration settings, you might have 100% independent review to make sure they're configured correctly. But for your low risk settings, you might sample those, or you might choose not to independently verify them. So every point in the life cycle where we've got review and verification activities, we can scale those based upon risk. And again, the nice thing in ProcedureCapture, because you can trace those requirements, specifications, and risk down the left-hand side of the traditional V model, you can scale the verification on that side of the life cycle as well.
Okay, great. Okay, I think that's us pretty much out of time. I'd just like to thank everybody for attending. We will put out the link to the recording of this if anybody wants to visit it later on. So I'd just like to thank David for attending, and also for all the attendees. Okay, thank you, and hopefully you join us for the third and last webinar. Thank you, bye-bye.